So, okay. So, thank very much that we have the chance to speak again. Everything is fine, no? Walter, you see us?
Yes, I see you, and
Okay.
I hear you, and you see me, and you hear me, so we're all okay.
Yeah, so let's begin the show.
Okay. I am going to speak for about 60 minutes, 1 hour, and my topic is privatization. I want to move everything to be private. My motto is, if it moves, privatize it. If it doesn't move, privatize it. And since everything either moves or doesn't move, we privatize everything. Now, I've written 3 books on this. One is a thing called Water Capitalism. Can you see the
Yes.
front of the book? And this is to privatize oceans, rivers, lakes, and aquifers, that underground water. Another book is Space Capitalism. We should privatize the space race, and we should privatize the moon and Mars and any other place where we go to. And the third book is Privatize Roads and Highways and Streets. And what I want to do is spend about 10 minutes on each book, and then I want to spend 10 minutes on why we should privatize anything, because maybe my next book will be why we should privatize cities, so libraries and city streets and taxi cabs and buses and everything else in a city. So why should we privatize anything? 10 minutes, and then 10 minutes on each of the books, and then maybe questions and answers and discussion for another 20 minutes. Okay, why should we privatize anything, everything? Well, I think there are 2 reasons. One reason is ethics. If you privatize something, we can engage in voluntary trade with each other, which is ethical. Because it's not ethical if you use force or violence, whereas if the government owns it and it's not privatized, then the government gets involved, and the government is necessarily coercive. It compels people to pay taxes whether they've agreed to or not. It compels people to obey their regulations whether they've agreed to or not. So the one case or one argument in case of privatization of anything is that it's more ethical. Another one is more economical. We as consumers have much more control over producers than we as voters have over the government bureaucrats and politicians. We don't have very much control over what they do in our role as voters, vis-a-vis them as politicians or regulators, whereas we as consumers have much more control over producers. So from an economic point of view, if you want to promote economic welfare, what you have to do is favor privatization. For example, let's compare the dollar vote and the political vote. How often does the political vote occur? Every 2 years, maybe every 4 years? How often does the dollar vote occur? Well, I see you people, they're sitting on nice couches. You all have shirts and shoes and clothing, and there are books in the back, and you have curtains on the wall. Somebody's turning around looking. Yes, you do. You voted for those whenever you wanted. I have a wristwatch here. I have glasses. I have a shirt. I can vote anytime I want. It's now 1:30 in my time. I guess it's around dinner time, your time. And I voted for lunch. In other words, you can vote whenever you want. We vote, I don't know how many times a day, 2 or 3, 5 times a day. Whereas for politicians, we only vote every 2 years or every 4 years. Another one is when we vote politically, we have a package deal. For example, in our last election, it was an election between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. Now, suppose we like Donald Trump on policies 1, 3, 5, and 7, and we like Hillary Clinton on policies 2, 4, 6, and 8. We have to take a package deal. We just can't pick what we want. We have to take all of Hillary Clinton or all of Donald Trump. We can't pick and choose. I have a brown shirt. I could pick and choose a brown shirt, and I don't have to take a certain kind of sandwich with it, which I would if it was a package deal. So it's much better that We have a narrow focus. Another one is irrational ignorance. If I want to go buy a motorcycle, what I'm going to do is I'll ask friends of mine who have a motorcycle. I'll do a little research on motorcycles. I will maybe not become an expert on motorcycles, but I will learn a little bit about motorcycles. And because if I don't, I'll get a bad motorcycle. On the other hand, people who are voters in the political ballot, there's this guy, Rush Limbaugh, a famous political theorist in the United States, who calls certain people low information voters. Well, they can vote for Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump without knowing anything. You know, as long as they're over, I don't know what the age of voting is, 21 or something like that. In other words, you have low information voters, so you have a lot of rational ignorance. And also, what does one vote count? If there are millions of people voting, one vote isn't going to make much difference. Whereas if I vote for this kind of a motorcycle versus that kind of a motorcycle, my vote is definitive. So there are lots of reasons why we should put more and more things in the marketplace and take them out of the government apparatus. And then we have the usual examples of East Germany versus West Germany, and North Korea versus South Korea, and the USSR, where they had, and Venezuela now, and Cuba, where they had a lot of stuff in the public sector and very little in the private sector. And then we have other countries like Hong Kong, or well, I don't know about Hong Kong now, but Hong Kong before we had the recent troubles. Switzerland, the United States, Canada, much richer countries where they put more emphasis on the private sector. Okay, so that's my first 10 minutes or so, or the first quarter of my discussion. Why we should privatize anything, why we have a general case in favor of privatization. Now what I want to do is talk about specifics, and the specifics that I picked are roads and oceans and the space race. And why did I pick those? Well, the reason I picked those, it's sort of like shooting fish in a barrel to pick why we should privatize the post office. Not that I'm against privatizing the post office, but it's very easy to see that the free enterprise system could privatize the post office, or could maybe privatize buses or streetcars or things like that. What I want to do is take tougher cases. The idea here is that if we can make the case for privatizing the unprivatizable, or privatizing stuff that is not easy to see how we could privatize it, then it'll be much easier to make the case for privatizing things like, say, a library. We have public libraries. I don't know what they have in Hungary, but in the United States, they have private libraries. And it's easy to see how we could do that, because a lot of bookstores, you know, allow you to sit there and read. So it's easy to see that. And I wanted to take tough cases, because I don't believe in taking the easy. I'm not against taking easy cases, but I think we should also try to take hard cases on the ground that if we can succeed with hard cases, then it'll be easier to succeed with easier cases. And also, this is sort of radical, the favor of privatizing streets and roads and oceans and space. And we make the case for privatizing easier things easier. Because if people object to that, then the people who are promoting privatization of libraries or streetcars can say, well, if you can't do this, think about the tougher cases. So I think it's easier to make easier cases if we can also make tough cases. Okay, now let me talk first about this book, Privatizing Roads. What was my motivation for privatizing roads? Why did I want to privatize roads and streets? I have two motivations. One, I don't know what the statistics are in Hungary. Again, I'm sorry, I'm ignorant of those facts. But in the United States, do you know how many people die on the nation's highways? Something like 40,000. 40,000 people die on motor vehicle accidents. And I'm sure it's proportional to, we have about 330 million people in the United States. 40,000 is, I guess, 1%. And probably in Hungary, it's similar. 1% of people die, or is it 1/10 of 1%? I'm not sure, but a lot of people die. In the U.S., they were very upset with 9/11 when World Trade Towers in New York City were bombed, and I think something like 3,000 people died then. And that was only once, and people were very upset about that, rightfully so. And here's 40,000 every year, something like 40,000. Some it's 41,000, sometimes 37,000, but it's around 40,000 people, and that's horrible. That was my main motivation for writing the book. The second motivation, I don't know what the traffic jams are like in Hungary, but in the U.S., we have rush hour in the morning and in the evening, and you just sit there and bumper to bumper traffic, nobody's moving. The fastest way to get around a city is on a bicycle or maybe on skates, and a car capable of doing 60, 70 miles an hour can't go anywhere. Whereas a bicycle, or if you're a good runner, you can get around the city quicker. But that's a minor inconvenience. The major thing is a lot of people die. Now, why do the people say that we have these deaths? And they have all sorts of reasons why we have deaths. For example, driving while drunk, or speeding, or vehicle malfunction, or driver error. There's this guy, Sam Peltzman, at the University of Chicago, which is supposed to be a free enterprise operation, University of Chicago, but these people are road socialists. I once was in a debate with Milton Friedman, and I called him a road socialist because he favored the government ownership of roads. And he didn't like me calling him a road socialist. But, you know, what is it? If it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, maybe it is a duck. Well, Milton Friedman favored government roads. So you favor government doing something, you're a socialist. So Sam Peltzman has like 25 different causes of road fatalities. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration has 125 different explanations, causal explanations as to why we have deaths. And they list all sorts of very arcane things you wouldn't have thought about. For example, does the hospital have helicopters or just cars? Well, if they have helicopters, then they can save more lives than if they just have an ambulance, a vehicle, a road vehicle. Things like that you probably wouldn't have thought of. I didn't think about it until I read 125 different explanations. Now, my criticism of all of this is these are only proximate causes. The ultimate cause is the road manager, which is the government. Look, suppose we're brought in as experts on why restaurants go broke. We're managerial theorists. And we think that maybe the restaurant went broke because it was located on the wrong place. Location are very important for where you locate the restaurant. If you locate the restaurant on a cul-de-sac where there's no traffic, you're not going to get too many customers. Maybe they didn't have a good chef. Maybe they didn't have the place wasn't clean enough. Is that why the restaurant went broke? No, those are just proximate causes. The ultimate cause is the manager of the restaurant didn't locate the restaurant on a busy cross street where there were two big streets, didn't hire a good chef, didn't hire a good waitress, didn't hire a cleaning staff. Look, suppose I take a gun, here's a gun, and I'm going to shoot somebody right through the window, and I'm going to hit somebody outside. And everyone grabs me and says, you're a murderer. I say, no, I'm not a murderer. I'm just, the bullet killed him. Yeah, the bullet is the proximate cause, but I'm the ultimate cause. I'm the murderer. So just as I'm the murderer, not the bullet. Bullet is innocent. I'm the murderer, and the restaurant manager is the guilty party, not the bad food or location. This is the same thing with the roads. It's the manager of the roads that doesn't stop drunk driving. It's the manager of the roads that doesn't stop speeding. It's the manager of the roads that doesn't stop vehicle breakdowns or driver error or texting or whatever it is. Now, look, we have a theory. One of our theories in economics is that you'll get a better product if you have competition. If you have competition,
Uh-oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry. Sorry for the interruption. If we have competition, we get a better product. The reason we have pretty good shirts and pretty good wristwatches and pretty good eyeglasses is we have competition. If we had a monopoly, one person, we wouldn't have much competition. So I say it's the same thing with roads. In the United States, the rules of the road are set out by Washington, D.C. And Washington, D.C. Sets up one set of rules, and that's it. It would be much better if we had 50 states. Each state had their own rules, but each state is a problem with a state is that they can't go broke if they make a mistake, whereas a private company can go broke if they make a mistake. Happily, we no longer have typewriters. Why? Because we now have computers. We don't have Kodak films because we have, again, computers. So it's very important that we have exit of firms that don't do a good job in satisfying customers. So I'm not favoring 50 different states because each state would then couldn't go broke. What I want is private roads. Each road and each street should be privately owned. And then when it's privately owned, if they don't do a good job, they can go broke. And if they do a good job, then they can maybe expand their operation. Let me give you some examples of this. Right now, on the major highways in the United States, you have a minimum speed of 40 miles an hour and a maximum speed of 70 miles an hour. You people are on the kilometers per hour, I guess, but you understand what 40 miles an hour and 70 miles an hour is. 70 miles an hour is something like, I guess, 110 kilometers an hour, something like that.
Yes.
Is this the best way to minimize deaths? I don't know. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Maybe a better way would be each lane should have a different speed limit. Like on the right lane, the slow lane, everyone should have to do 50 miles an hour. And in the middle lane, everyone should have to do 65 miles an hour. And in the left lane, everyone should have to do 80 miles an hour. Do you think that would work? I don't know. I'm not a road theorist. I'm just an ignorant economist. And I'm trying to apply what I know about shoes and bicycles competition to another area, namely roads. And in this area of roads, I think that if on your road you did 50, 65, and 80, and on some other road it was 60, 70, and 80, and some other road it was 50, 60, and 70, and maybe in the Autobahn, I think in Germany, they go even faster. Maybe it should be 70, 80, and 90. I don't know. But if we had competition and we would see which road did the best, then we would learn how to do it better. So that would be one way. Another way is, every once in a while you'll see a truck. And there are two trucks, and let's say there are only two lanes. And one truck is behind the other truck, and the truck behind is going to try to pass the truck in the front. And it's going to take them 15 minutes to pass at 55 miles an hour because the big trucks go slowly. So what I do, don't tell the cops, what I do is I speed up to try to get ahead of the second truck so that I'm not going to wait 15 minutes for the two of them to ride. And on my road, if I own a road, I would tell the truck on the right, the one that's being passed, slow down for, a minute or two. Let the other guy get past you. And if you race the truck and wait, make everyone wait for 15 minutes, I'm going to give you a ticket. Another peeve that I have is sometimes on the highways, the maximum speed is 70, but everyone does about 75 or 80 on the major highways, especially when there's no traffic. And somebody's sitting in the left lane doing 70, and everybody has to go around them. And my theory is that it's not so much speed, it's rather lane changing. And if we had a rule, now they do have a rule that you're not allowed to pass on the right. And if you're slow, you should stay to the right, but they don't enforce that very much. So that would be another way that we could maybe save lives. And also, if everybody had to do 55 and 70 and 85 in the three lanes, maybe it's not speed, but it's the variation in speed. If you have a big standard deviation of speed and some people are going very fast and other people are going slower and they're on the same lane, well, maybe that's the cause of the deaths. Another suggestion I had is whenever there's a lot of deaths on a road, I'll put a big cross or a big Jewish star or a big Muslim indication to show deaths there, and maybe it'll scare people. Now they do it, but private people do it. When a loved one died, and the sign will be 3 feet high. I'm talking about a sign 50 feet high. Maybe that would work. So what I do in the first half of this book is I make the case that we'll have fewer deaths, and how could this possibly be done? That's the first half of the book. And in the second half of the book, I deal with objections. There are all sorts of objections. You'd be amazed as to how many objections there are to people privatizing roads. One, I'm not going to go through them all. I've only got 10 minutes, and I probably passed my 10-minute limit. I'll do a little less on space and oceans. One of them is you'll be trapped in your house. In other words, if there was a private road and you want to get out onto the road, the guy says, okay, give me $1 million. Well, namely, the road owner will trap you in your house. See, right now, when you buy a house, you have to have title insurance. Title insurance means you want to make sure that the guy from whom you're buying the house really is the owner of the house. Well, now you would have a thing called access insurance. You would make sure that you could get in and out of your house without paying $1 million each time. And the road owner would have an incentive to give you a contract like that because he wants people to live on his road. If nobody had a house or a factory on his road, he wouldn't make much money from having a road. So I deal with a whole bunch of objections to private road ownership in the second half of the book, and that's pretty much the book. And on congestion, just let me mention congestion briefly because it's much less important than deaths and fatalities. What we need is peak load pricing. You know, the ski resort charges a lot of money in the winter, and in the summer they charge very little. And in the beach, they charge more when people want to go to the beach. Well, on my road, I would charge a lot more during the morning rush hour and the afternoon rush hour than I charge at 3 in the morning. You want to ride on my road 3 in the morning? It'd be very cheap. And another objection, just I'll mention one more objection as well. Do you have to take, you have to pay for it? Well, you know, what they do is they call it a freeway in the United States, but it's not free. It's a taxway. It's paid for by taxes. Of course, you'd have to pay for it. You pay for your shirts and your shoes. Why shouldn't you pay for roads? But then the problem is you're riding along a street. You have to put a nickel in every house in front. No. We now have mechanical ways of charging you for, you know, we have on most things, we have universal product codes, you know, those bar codes. And you put that at the bottom of a car, and then you see a computer notes where you were, and then they send you a bill at the end of the month or something like that. And then there's an objection about privacy and all sorts of other things. So enough on roads. The next one I'll do is my book on oceans. Here's my book on oceans. Why we should privatize oceans, rivers, lakes, aquifers. I wanted to put mud puddles in there, but the publisher objected to that title. I wanted to be thorough and include mud puddles, but I always think of mud puddles in there as well. So what's my motivation for this? Well, part of my motivation is deaths. Katrina, the storm Katrina, I'm in New Orleans. Yep. Katrina was a storm. It never really hit New Orleans. It was about 40 miles east of us, but it was damaging enough that whole bunches of buildings were knocked down. 1,900 people died in Katrina. Why did they die? They died because the levees fell. The levees were keeping the Mississippi River out of the city. The city is actually below sea level, similar to what's going on in what's that country in Europe? Right, Holland is a little bit below the sea level. New Orleans is like that. So we have levees to keep us from keep the water out of the city. And who put in the levees? the Army Corps of Engineers, which is a government operation. See, I don't mind, as a person, I mind very much that 1,900 innocent people died. As an economist, it doesn't bother me that much. What really bothers me as an economist is those people are still in business. Look, if Burger King or McDonald's killed 1,900 people, they wouldn't be in business anymore. That's why we have pretty good burgers, because if you do a bad job, you lose money, you go broke. But the ownership of the Mississippi River is the government, and the government doesn't go broke, and the Army Corps of Engineers, bless them, are still in business. Well, if there was a private Mississippi River, the Mississippi River Corporation would go broke. They'd be sued, and somebody else would take over the Mississippi River and maybe build better levees. So one motivation is for privatization is, again, to save lives. Another motivation is a thing called the tragedy of the commons.
Yep.
If something is owned in common, people tend not to take too much good care of it. They the best example I can think of is the buffalo was never privately owned and was always almost went extinct. The cow was always privately owned and never went within 1 million miles of being extinct. Why? Because if you killed a cow that you own, tomorrow you wouldn't have the cow. So it was a high price to kill the cow. Whereas if you killed a buffalo, you wouldn't have the buffalo anyway because you couldn't own the buffalo. And the cost to you of killing a buffalo would be very low. So we had overkilling a buffalo. Well, whales are just a big buffalo that swim, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, the biologists might not like this, but from an economics point of view, the whale is just a big buffalo. And we're running out of whales. We have whale extinction. We have fish extinction, except for fish farms, which is privately owned. So if we own the ocean, we would deal a bit with the tragedy of the commons. It would be owned. I would own all the whales, and then I would make sure that the whales stayed around. There was even a Star Trek movie where the whales went extinct, and the guys from the 25th century were kicking the butt of the guys in the 23rd century, and the guys in the 23rd century had to come back to the 20th century to get some whales. Don't ask me about that, but whales are important and we don't want them to go extinct, and fish are important. We don't want them to go extinct, and they even have fishing seasons. Can you imagine fishing seasons where you're not allowed to fish, or you're only allowed to fish a few weeks a year? We don't have shirt seasons. We don't have wristwatch seasons. You can make a shirt anytime you want. Why do they have fishing seasons? Because of the tragedy of the commons. We're running out of fish. And we should, and then what they do is the fishermen, they make very good boats and very good nets because they can only fish a few weeks a year. So they really fish a lot. I mean, the whole thing is crazy. And if we had privatization of rivers and lakes and oceans, we wouldn't have that problem. In California now, California is sort of going the route of Venezuela with socialism there. What they have is they're running out of water. Why are they running out of water? Because there's a zero price for water, or a very, very low price for water. Well, whenever, there's the supply and demand curve, and whenever the price is around zero, demand is greater than supply, and you're always running out of stuff. So we wouldn't have that problem if we had ownership of rivers and lakes and oceans. Another part of this book, Water Capitalism, is, well, how would we privatize the Mississippi River? Well, we had the same problem in the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union fell apart and then it became Russia, they had a whole bunch of government ownership of collectivized agriculture and factories and stores that had to be privatized. Did they do it perfectly? No, but at least they did it. There was this case in Canada, BCRIC, British Columbia. BCRIC was what was RIC? A Resource Investment Corporation. There was a socialist government in the Canadian province of British Columbia, and they owned all sorts of forests and mills and lumber and stuff like that. And then they privatized it. What they did is they said, we're making a new private corporation. We're giving every member of British Columbia 5 shares in the company. Well, we could do the same thing with the Mississippi River. Now, one way to do it is to sell it. Have an auction. You want to buy a share of the Mississippi River? Cost you $1,000. The problem with that is then the government would get the money. And I'm not a big fan of government. I'm a libertarian. I think the less money the government has, the better. So I don't like auctions. Rather, I'm a fan of John Locke, the philosopher, and Murray Rothbard, who talk about homesteading. So I asked, well, who's been using the Mississippi River? Well, I assume all the people that own land on the sides of the Mississippi River use the Mississippi River. And then all the boats, the owners of the boats who went up and down the Mississippi River. And let's say there are 100,000 people like that, 100,000 shares. And now we have a Mississippi River Corporation. And we have 100,000 people each owning 1 share in it. And that's how you would privatize it. Now, I admit that privatizing the ocean is really tough because you have this thing called evaporation. The water evaporates, and then it goes into the clouds, and the clouds rain on the land, and then the water goes through the lakes and the rivers and back out into the ocean. It's sort of a circular thing. So it's a much more difficult case to privatize water than it is to privatize land. But my motto here is land is just, what is it? Land is slow-moving water, and water is fast-moving land. See, everyone says, well, yes, you can privatize land, fine. But you can't privatize water because water keeps moving around. But no, there is some water that doesn't move around, namely ice. Ice is water, but it just sits there. And then there's land that moves. It's a thing called mudslides where the land moves. So what I'm trying to do is not see the difference between water and land, but see the similarities, because I want to privatize both. And it's easier to conceive of how you can do it with land and water. So I'm trying to look at the similarities of land and water. Okay, now the third book is Space Capitalism. I don't know if you can see this. It's sort of hard to see because it's a dark cover, but it's Space Capitalism. And the subtitle is How Humans Will Colonize Planets, Moons, and Asteroids. So what's my motivation here? Again, my main motivation is saving lives. You know that the scientists say that who are those guys? The big animals that would kill everybody. The dinosaurs. I'm getting senile. Pretty soon I'll be drooling all over the place. The dinosaurs. The dinosaurs were killed a couple of million years ago by an asteroid as big as a whole city that fell into the Gulf of Mexico and created such havoc that the dinosaurs all died. Well, if another asteroid hits us, we're all going to die. Well, a lot of us are going to die. And I am pro-human. I'm pro-human. Some of my best friends are human beings. I like human beings. I have grandchildren. They're human beings. I want human beings to survive. And if an asteroid hits the Earth and every human being on the Earth dies, I'd like there to be some human beings on the moon and on Mars, so that the human race could go on. So one reason for wanting to privatize the space race and to privatize the land on the moon and the land on Mars is because I think free enterprise is the best way to go. Free enterprise will set you free. Free enterprise will maximize wealth. And if we had free enterprise running the space race instead of the government, we would, if instead of having the U.S. government do the moonshot in 1960, somewhere in the 1960s, if it had only been done privately, we'd probably have colonies on the moon and Mars right now. But the government slowed us up. They did the wrong technology. Maybe what they should have done, I'm sort of now into the Austrian business cycle theory here. What you want is certain technology to increase at a certain rate. Maybe we should have worked on rocket fuels or technology more than getting a man on the moon in 1960. I don't know about this, but it's a possibility. And also government is very wasteful. Now, there is this guy, what's his name? I can't think of his name. I'll think of it. Elon Musk. That's it. Uh, right now, you take an airplane. I live in New Orleans. You take an airplane from New Orleans to what city are you in Hungary?
Budapest.
Budapest. Okay. What do they do with the airplane after it takes me from New Orleans to Budapest? Well, it comes from Budapest and goes to London, or it goes to New York, or who knows where it goes. But they don't junk the airplane. Can you imagine if every time somebody took a plane from New Orleans to Budapest, they had to throw away the airplane? Do you know how expensive that would be to have air travel? You could only use it once. Well, that's the way the government was doing it. The government was shooting up rockets, and when the rockets were finished, that was it, one shot. Elon Musk, a private entrepreneur, true, subsidized by government, but that's another issue, came up with a way of reusing rockets, namely making rockets much cheaper, space travel much cheaper. So I think this is just an illustration of the fact that government is always more efficient, less efficient. Sorry, I'm getting senile again. Government is always less efficient in everything, and certainly in rocketry. So I think we would have a much better chance of having colonies on the moon and Mars if the government got out of it and allowed private enterprise to have all that tax money that they're using. So I think that would be great. And then when we get to the moon and Mars, I think what we should do is privatize the moon and Mars. We shouldn't have government owning all of the place. Now, you have a problem of, how intensive does the homesteading have to be? East of the Mississippi in the United States, the land is fertile, so you don't need that much land to keep a family of four going, and the usual rule was 160 acres. West of the Mississippi, it's a little less fertile, so you needed 1,600 acres, and if you're in the Sahara Desert, you probably need even more. So how much land should you get if you land on the moon? Should you get the whole moon? No. But you shouldn't just get 1 acre. You should maybe get 10 square miles or 100 square miles or something like that. So the book goes into who should get to own what parts of the moon and what parts of Mars. And then you get into problems of, what do they call it, public goods. Supposed to be terraform the atmosphere on Mars, and everyone will benefit. But then if I do it, you'll benefit. So therefore you won't do it. So we have this problem of externalities. So the book deals with all sorts of problems of getting to the moon and Mars, having colonies on the moon and Mars, and terraforming, namely making an atmosphere on Mars so you don't have to have a spacesuit. And I think it's easier to do on Mars than the moon, but I'm not sure. Again, I'm not an astronomer. I'm just a poor, ignorant economist trying to apply what I know from economics to esoteric areas. Okay, well, now I've done about 40 minutes. And to just review, I first gave the case for privatization in general, and then I applied it to 3 different areas, which were all of a bit of a challenge: roads, oceans, space. And now it's your turn to have questions and discussion. Yes?
Good.
Sure.
Shoot.
So, can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you perfectly.
So a little bit of a context. So the older people here, they have all lived through socialism and through a massive privatization. So we have actually seen how privatization happens. And even though the results are, obviously marvelous, it's beyond comparison. However, one of the difficulties of the process was that because it was done in a particular way, in different ways in different countries, many people's experience of privatization was that they suddenly were not able to do things that they were be able to do for years and decades and for generations even perhaps. So the experience of privatization is, for many people, is a instantaneous and massive loss of freedom. And even though we know from economic theory that eventually, property will settle with those who use it efficiently, where it starts from, even though it's not important in the long run, it's super important in the short run, because that's what people are going to fight about.
That is the right.
And that is where privatization will be derailed even before it happens. So my question is, do your books or does your research give enough consideration in doing the privatization in a peaceful and orderly manner in such a way that it's acceptable to people who...
So it's very unpopular with a lot of people.
Exactly. It's hugely unpopular, and for good reasons. I mean, you can't say that, I was going to that beach for 30 years and now suddenly I can't and I don't get any compensation for
But
that.
I have to pay for it, like in the Balaton, no?
Yeah. Right.
You have to pay 2,000 for
So
it, which was
usually
always
the act
here.
of privatization entails a bunch of people suddenly losing access without getting a compensation. So how do you deal with these problems?
Would you permit me, before you answer, I would like to summarize where the theoretical problem is with your idea, which goes to speak to these things here. But if I understood you correctly, I'm sorry, if I understood you correctly, you are advocating to give away something that the government, who would privatize it, had no investment in creating or owning, and then taking it away from public ownership at no cost to the government, and give it to people who also don't have any investment in it, into their ownership. Now, you are treating certain phenomena quite superficially in order to support your theory, but in fact, it's quite fallacious, I must say. For instance, I don't want to go into, have you ever driven on private road in Mexico, for instance, versus the public road, because I have. So there are many empirical things to throw against your theory. However, let's stick to New Orleans. Why is New Orleans below the level of Mississippi? How did this happen? Why did they put New Orleans there when they knew there is nothing but problem coming from that situation? Well, you neglected to consider that originally when New Orleans was put there, it was in level, very much level, and the river was deeper than the surface of the city. But private enterprise siphoned the water out of the aquifer beneath the city, so the city is gradually and permanently sinking. And every year it's getting lower and lower below the level of the Mississippi. Now, how did it happen that those levees were too weak? The government measured up what to expect, how to make the best possible dams. And they figured that there has never been a stronger than number 3 strength storm there before. So they ordered the sufficient commensurate size of dams. It was not the fault of the Army Corps of Engineers, but it was a mistaken assumption of what to expect. There has never been a number 5 hurricane in New Orleans before this. So it was a fatal mistake combined with the fact that the private enterprise siphoned out the water from beneath the city. So the theory does not stand up against the facts here. But my main objection is that you propose to give away something that you haven't invested in, had no stake in it, like the public libraries, for instance. Nobody paid for, but the public, for those libraries, and you give them away to private people. Why? So who will make money there? The public certainly not makes money on this. Well, I think I said enough, although I could say more.
Well, I am delighted that you offer me a challenge, both of you, an important challenge, because this is the way to get to the truth. Nowadays, all too often in universities, we have such political correctness. If you say something against the speaker, you're guilty of hate speech. and they don't allow you to speak. We don't believe in that. We believe in having.
Against you, only I question your theory, that's all. You are a very nice guy by all estimation.
Only my mother thinks I'm a very nice guy. Let me answer I took notes. Let me try to answer all the objections. First of all, with regard to the beach, you were paying for that beach before. It's not that the beach was free. You were paying for it through taxes. Now you're paying for it in a different way. So it's not as if you weren't paying for something, you had it for free, and then all of a sudden you have to pay taxes. Now the question is, well, which way are you paying more? Well, I think the government is less efficient than private enterprise, and therefore the taxes be more. And not just for the beach, for the library, for the transportation, for anything. So tell the people in Hungary who don't like privatization because they think they have to pay for something now and they didn't have to pay for it before. Tell them they were paying for it before. And they were paying more for it before. In the US, I think I mentioned they call it a freeway. It's not a freeway. It's a taxway. We pay for those highways through taxes. So don't think that if we privatized the highways and the streets, and now all of a sudden private people were charging us for it, that some freedom was being taken away from us. Or actually, wealth is taken away from us, not freedom. Don't think that. You're paying less. Okay, the second problem is the process of privatization is very, very important. And I think this gentleman makes a very excellent point that the process is important. Both people made that point that in the long run, yes, Keynes said in the long run we'll all be dead. And in the long run, yes, privatization is great. And I do admit that in these three books, I spoke mostly about the case for privatization in the long run. But I talked about the process as well. Not as much because it's so crazy. I mean, if you go out in the street and say we should privatize roads or oceans or the moon or Mars, they're going to think you're crazy. So my main effort was in privatization of not the process, but the goal. But this gentleman says, well, you're giving it to people that had no stake in it. No. I'm giving it to people who had some stake in it, namely who were using it. The Mississippi River, I'm giving it to the people who had land on the side of the Mississippi River on the ground that they were probably using it. And probably the more acreage you had on the side of the Mississippi River, the more shares you would get. If you had only 1 acre, you'd get maybe 1 share. If you had 100 acres all along the Mississippi River, you might get 10 shares or whatever the exact numbers are. And the people that had those boats going up and down the Mississippi River, they were using it. Well, this is the John Locke homesteading theory. You get to own something if you use it. Now take the libraries. Where did the money for the libraries come from? From taxpayers. So I would give the libraries to the people who paid taxes for the libraries. And the more you paid in taxes, the richer you were, the more share of the libraries you would have. So I reject that criticism as well. Now, the question about the sea level and New Orleans sinking, this gentleman, I think, is, I have a problem with what he said, because what he said, he was blaming it on private enterprise. No. In this book here, let me mention that it's called The Case for Privatizing Oceans, Rivers, Lakes, and Aquifers. What's an aquifer? An aquifer is underground water. And they were using this water. Who owned that water? Who owned the water under the New Orleans? It wasn't privately owned. It was the tragedy of the commons, or it was government owned. What you're doing is you're blaming private enterprise for a government problem. Yes, New Orleans sunk, not due to private enterprise. I don't see how you can blame private enterprise for water. Well, aquifers being depleted and the whole city sinking, and you blame that on private enterprise? Give me a break. This is a government operation. So I reject this criticism. I think it's very well thought out, and I appreciate the gentleman making this criticism. But when he says that it's the dams are due to private enterprise, look, I had a full head of hair before I started this lecture. Look at me now. I pulled out my hair because he said that it was due to private enterprise. It was not due to private enterprise, due to government. Next question.
You are distorting what I said.
Okay.
I would not buy private enterprise. And the government did not stop it. It's true. But the size of the dams, which you didn't address actually, was no private enterprise would be able or willing to build these or any other dams to protect the city. They were too large to build by private enterprise. Only the government had enough power and money and human resources to build them. So private enterprise was simply unable, wouldn't even attempt. And probably the same argument goes for the privatization of space, because Elon Musk waited 40, 50 years before the government experimented enough and invested enough to develop the technology high enough so he can start from there and start privatizing. And we all know, more or less all of us, that the government always had the intention of engaging private enterprise eventually in space exploration. So there is a bit of distinction has to be made, that certain things cannot be done without the government. Just to mention the New Deal, for instance.
Oy vey. That's a beautiful question. The New Deal. The New Deal is a whole different subject. Look, this
the road system was
let me respond. Look, this. First of all, this is an entirely different argument that there are certain things that are just too big for private enterprise and only the government can do. This was not mentioned initially. I disagree with this also respectfully. I don't think there's anything that's too big for the private enterprise to do. All you have to do is go to the stock market. And you go to the stock market and say, I've got this great idea and it's going to take $1 trillion, but it's going to make a lot of profit, and anyone want to buy in? And if you want to, and if enough people think it's worthwhile, the stock market can amalgamate resources. You don't need coercion. You don't need a government gun to compel people to contribute to a profit-making enterprise. You can have private dams. Just because it's big doesn't mean that private enterprise can't do it. There are private enterprises that are bigger in the United States, that are bigger than some entire countries in terms of wealth. So I disagree with that. I don't think that there are certain things that are too large for private enterprise. And as far as the government is engaging, I don't like this engaging business, because that's fascism. Sometimes people talk about private-public partnerships. That's fascism. We don't want private-public partnerships. We don't want government to liaise with private companies and contract out stuff. We want to privatize sanitation garbage collection. We don't want government to be in charge of sanitation and then contract out to private garbage collectors. We want to just have good old private enterprise. Look, right now, all restaurants in the United States are private. Suppose the government were in charge of all restaurants, and some maniac like me said, well, you can have private enterprise for restaurants. And somebody said, well, you can't have big restaurants because, you can't only government can have big restaurants. We need big restaurants. Well, that's a problem. So look, suppose the government owned all the restaurants, and then it contracted out with McDonald's or Burger King or Wendy's to run restaurants. Is that a better system than letting them just own it themselves? No. Why should the government contract out? Why should the government be involved? The libertarian view is that the government should be very, very minimal. It should be maybe in charge of armies and courts and police, and that's about it. But when you get government in business, then you have economic fascism, and I certainly oppose that. We have 4 minutes left. Any other questions? Maybe some other person who wants to have a turn? No?
I have a question.
Yes.
Actually, it relates to your previous lecture when you were talking about privatizing forest, privatizing the Amazonas forest. And then my question is that who would make profit out of it? So how to make profit out of the Amazonas forest? So I can then
Who's gonna buy it?
who's gonna buy it? Because I can buy it perhaps, but then I can make money out of it only if I can charge 6 billion people who are using the good effects. Let's suppose it has good effects. Then
Ozone.
it has
Oxygen.
perhaps it has great effects for 6 billion people, and I can make money out of the Amazonas forest only if I can charge the 6 billion people for using it. So why to own the forest? How to make profit out of it?
Well, a lot of, I don't know about Brazil, and I don't know about that much about other countries, but in the United States, we have large paper companies that own tens of thousands of acres of forests. And what they do is every 20 years, they cut them down and they make paper and they make wood for houses. That would be the reason to own it. And now what you're really doing is you're saying, well, there are externalities. There are positive externalities.
Yeah.
Namely, not only would you be giving, what do you call it, wood, not only would you be getting wood, but you would also be giving oxygen to everybody. And you can't charge for oxygen because oxygen is not a scarce good. At least here on the moon and Mars, oxygen will be a scarce good. But there's a whole literature on the so-called market failure of external economies. And I think that the answer to the question is the wood enough would be alone to ensure that people would want to own trees and cut them down. If the tree, it takes 20 years to grow to its full height, and it depends upon the interest rate as to how many years you would allow it to grow. If every 20 years you cut down 1/20th of the trees in order to make wood or paper, well, then we would have as an external benefit. And there's nothing wrong with external benefits. Look, I don't know about you, but my favorite composers are Bach and Mozart. And Bach and Mozart, they give me great pleasure. I named both of my children after them. One is named Amadeus, and the other is named after Johann. They gave me great pleasure, right? They got paid, but they gave so much pleasure to everybody else. That's what civilization is all about, right? Language, we all speak English, or you guys speak Hungarian. There are external benefits. This is the whole point of having civilization. And you can't say it's a market failure and therefore the government has got to make sure we speak better English or anything like that. I think the fact that people want to have wood and people want to have paper is enough so that we can ensure that we'll have oxygen. The problem now is in California, all the forests are burning. Why are all the forests burning? The forests are all burning because they're owned by the government.
Mm-hmm.
Government can't take care of the forests. If we had private forests, we'd have less forest fires. Well, look, I promised you guys an hour. And before you ask me any more rough questions that I can't answer, I got to get off. I've been saved by the bell. But I greatly enjoyed having you as my audience, and I hope that we did some good for promoting liberty and good economics today.
Yeah. We enjoyed very much. Thanks so much. Have a good time. Opa.